On a quiet morning in California on August 6, 1945, as newspapers around the world prepared to announce the bombing of Hiroshima, another aviation drama was unfolding in the sky. A test flight of a Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star jet soared above the landscape, cutting through the air with a promise of the future. Yet as fate would have it, the plane's pilot, an American hero barely in his mid-20s, would never return safely to Earth. He was Richard Ira Bong, the ace whose feats in the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning had made him a living legend. His sudden death on a day so momentous in world history overshadowed a life story that was, in its own right, as extraordinary as any war headline. Had he lived, many believe he might have shaped post-war aviation as dynamically as he had dominated the skies of the South Pacific. And so we begin with a question. How can a figure so revered, America's ace of aces, be remembered by a nation consumed with a war's final act? Perhaps the conflict itself, with all its twists and tragedies, best tells us who he truly was. He was born on September 24th, 1920, on a farm near Poplar, Wisconsin, just south of Superior. The region offered a tranquil setting of fields, dense forests, and a culture rooted in the simple virtues of hard work and neighborly support. Richard Bong's parents were Carl and Dora Bong, who both immigrated from Sweden. They instilled their children with a sense of diligence and modesty that was common among farming families. So it was never a question of whether the Bong kids would pitch in, but rather how quickly they could tackle chores before sundown. While life on the farm was occasionally harsh, it also brought a closeness to nature that would later parallel the serenity and alertness he would find in flying. Friends and relatives remember young Richard, often called Dick, as quiet, respectful, and surprisingly focused for his age. He had the curiosity typical of any small-town boy. If he wasn't helping with the livestock or wandering around the woods, he was tinkering with gadgets or losing himself in library books that spoke of new inventions in flight. Aviation was still a fledgling field in the 1920s, but Charles Lindbergh's historic transatlantic flight in 1927 captured imaginations nationwide, and Dick Bong was no exception. He began to gaze skyward whenever a single-engine plane passed overhead, often running across the fields to watch it disappear beyond the tree line. This everyday rural upbringing might seem distant from the cockpit of a cutting-edge fighter, yet it gave him that grounded, unassuming personality for which he became known. Throughout his teenage years, Bong excelled in school, though never in an ostentatious way. He had a knack for mechanical understanding, fixing broken items around the house, taking apart farm equipment to see how it worked, carefully reassembling it all. That skill, combined with a growing fascination for airplanes, set him on a path that few in Poplar, Wisconsin, had ever considered. By the time he graduated from the local high school, he was determined to find a way into an aviation program. While his parents' means were modest, his father, having come from Sweden with not much more than hope, believed in the promise of the American dream. He and Dora encouraged Dick to explore any opportunity that might come knocking. Opportunity did indeed arrive. In 1938, Bong enrolled at what was then known as Superior State Teachers College. Though the curriculum wasn't specifically tailored to aviation, he found time to join a civilian pilot training program, one of the federal initiatives designed to increase the pool of aviators in a world that was inching closer to open conflict. This was his first direct step into the air, where he discovered that the sense of calm he felt in the fields was magnified 1,000-fold when surrounded by clouds. Though a quiet individual on the ground, once at the controls, he radiated confidence. Instructors quickly noted his natural aptitude. He could fly precise maneuvers, demonstrating a near instinctual understanding of aerodynamics. The winds of war were picking up, and Bong, sensing that the United States might soon become involved, made the decision to join the Army Air Corps, which later became the U.S. Army Air Forces. He officially enlisted in May of 1941. This was a bold step, for the war in Europe had raged for nearly 2 years, and the Pacific was on edge. Yet Bong approached his choice with an earnest sense of duty and a readiness to test himself in the face of the unknown. Even after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, he didn't hesitate. The battle lines were being drawn, and Bong wanted to be part of the air war that was likely to unfold in the Pacific. Once he was in training, he found himself among a diverse group of young men eager to become pilots. The program was notoriously rigorous. Hours of classroom instruction on flight theory, engine mechanics, navigation, plus physical fitness regimens and countless hours in training aircraft. Bong thrived. He excelled at precision flying, formation drills, and the advanced maneuvers that prospective fighter pilots needed to master. One anecdote from these days became legendary. While practicing gunnery at a flight school in Arizona, he brushed so close to the ground that he reportedly caused the laundry, hanging on a nearby clothesline, to flap with the turbulence of his passing plane. This incident earned him a mild reprimand, but it also hinted at the boldness he would soon display in combat. He was fortunate to be mentored by excellent instructors, some of whom had flown in the early stages of the war or had served as advisors in foreign conflicts. They taught him not just about controlling an aircraft, but about the psychology of aerial combat. They spoke of the intense focus required to track an enemy plane through a dogfight, the necessity to remain calm even when your cockpit was riddled with bullets, and the importance of understanding that each mission demanded both skill and careful planning. Bong absorbed these lessons eagerly. He was a keen observer and a methodical thinker, traits that would later save his life on many occasions. By late 1942, Bong received orders that would change the trajectory of his life and the war itself. He was to be posted to the Pacific Theater. Stationed initially in Australia and then moving into the forward areas of New Guinea, he joined the ranks of fighter pilots struggling to slow the Japanese advance and push it back island by island. This was a grueling environment. Heat, humidity, disease, and tough terrain made the war in the Southwest Pacific a far cry from the calmer life Bong had known in Wisconsin. Still, he adapted to the new climate, forging bonds with fellow pilots who were similarly green but hungry to prove themselves. They flew missions day after day, sometimes returning with half-empty fuel tanks, bullet holes in their planes, or missing comrades. The aircraft that Bong would eventually tame was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a distinctive twin-boomed fighter that combined range, speed, and firepower. Many pilots struggled with the P-38's complexities, but Bong took to it almost immediately. Its twin engines provided a margin of safety over single-engine fighters, and its heavy armament, 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, gave him a lethal punch in dogfights. Historian accounts suggest that Bong felt a connection with the P-38, describing it as the best plane to be in if you had to fight alone. He loved the reliability and the confidence it inspired, especially on the long missions that stretched over open ocean or dense jungle. His first confirmed victories came soon after his arrival in New Guinea, where he was assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron. Though his early missions were nerve-wracking, he stayed calm under fire, often crediting his rural upbringing for instilling in him a certain patience and level-headedness. Word began to spread that this unassuming pilot from Wisconsin was racking up victories at a pace few could match. Despite being shy about personal accolades, Bong's achievements became essential morale boosters for his squadron. The men, weary from long deployments, found hope and pride in hearing about their soft-spoken ace who kept downing Japanese planes in near-impossible engagements. As his kill count rose, so did his responsibilities. He was transferred to the 49th Fighter Group, under which he would carry out many of his notable missions. The men around him observed that Bong's success was only partly about raw skill. Equally important were his meticulous preparations. He studied maps, memorized the flight characteristics of Japanese planes, and anticipated how enemy pilots might react in specific scenarios. Where some American pilots took more risks, Bong balanced audacity with careful calculation. His brand of aerial combat wasn't about flashy maneuvers for their own sake. It was about identifying the target, positioning himself advantageously, and delivering swift, decisive fire. By the spring of 1944, Bong's record of victories made him a living legend among American fighter pilots. He was awarded the Medal of Honor in December of that same year, presented by General Douglas MacArthur. The ceremony marked a peak moment in his career, not simply because of the medal's prestige, but because it signified how his consistent skill in the skies had become a powerful symbol of the Allies' progress against Japan. The medal recognized his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action, underscoring that beyond the numbers, Bong had risked his life time and time again to protect fellow servicemen on crucial missions. All heroes, though, have their burdens. As Bong continued to break records, the Army Air Forces placed him under increasing pressure. Many believed he was too valuable to risk losing in combat, and there were discussions about pulling him from active frontline duty for the sake of war bond tours back in the States. He resisted initially, feeling that his place was with the men who still had to confront Japanese fighters daily. However, the relentless schedule of combat flights was taking its toll on him, physically and psychologically. Some historians have speculated that Bong, typically cool-headed, began to show signs of strain, those subtle indicators that even the best pilots can be haunted by the mental rigors of war. Still, he carried on, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record and ultimately reaching 40 confirmed aerial victories, the highest total achieved by any American pilot during the war. Controversies around kill claims and tallies inevitably arose, as they often do with fighter aces. Some questioned whether Bong's official count was exact, pointing to the chaotic nature of aerial combat where multiple pilots might fire on the same target. Others believed that he may have had even more kills than documented, lost in the fog of the fast-paced dogfights. Official Air Force documents, debriefings from fellow pilots, and Bong's own after-action reports remain the primary sources. While no consensus on the perfect number has emerged, the widely accepted figure of 40 stands as testimony to his unmatched dominance in the air. Bong, for his part, rarely engaged in these debates. When pressed, he would simply credit the squadron and shift the conversation away from himself. Another area of delicate discussion revolved around the ethics of celebrating the destruction of enemy aircraft, especially after footage and stories of catastrophic outcomes for downed Japanese pilots circulated. Some pacifists and critical voices in the media argued that turning pilots into aces glamorized the grim reality of killing. In interviews, Bong occasionally addressed these concerns by emphasizing the necessity of neutralizing threats that could kill his fellow servicemen. He expressed no personal malice toward individual Japanese pilots. It was, in his view, strictly a matter of survival. Nevertheless, the moral complexities of war followed him, as they did many who found themselves in the thick of such life-and-death struggles. In the midst of his wartime service, Bong's personal life also took a dramatic turn. He fell in love with a woman named Marjorie Marge Vattendahl, a hometown girl from Superior, Wisconsin, whom he had met during earlier visits back home. Their correspondence bridged the distance between the South Pacific and the American Midwest. Whenever Bong managed to leave, he would hurry to see her, finding solace in her company and the promise of a future after the war. They married on February 10, 1945, and the news delighted everyone who had followed his story. Photos from that time show a beaming, boyish Bong standing next to Marge, seeming more at ease than he ever did in uniform. To him, this marriage represented the life he hoped to lead once the conflict ended, a life of normalcy away from the stress of daily combat missions. With his 40th victory tallied in December 1944, the Army Air Forces chose to reassign him to stateside duties, partly to preserve the mystique of their top ace, and partly out of genuine concern for his well-being. He was sent on a war bond tour and recognized at numerous patriotic gatherings, parades, and factory visits. Though he was never entirely comfortable in the role of public icon, he did his best to encourage citizens to continue supporting the war effort. The contrast between the quiet farmland boy and the uniformed celebrity was striking. He still signed autographs and accepted accolades with humility, often longing for the simpler times of either flying in combat or being at home with Marge. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, and the conflict in the Pacific turned toward its final months, the aviation world was rapidly evolving. Jet aircraft were on the horizon, and the Army Air Forces wanted talented pilots to test these pioneering designs. Richard Bong, recognized as one of the best aviators America had produced, was a prime candidate. So it was that he found himself in California, preparing to fly the new Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. This was an entirely different machine from the prop-driven P-38, propelled by a turbojet engine that demanded specialized knowledge and a new set of reflexes. Despite the complexities, Bong seemed eager to master the future of fighter aviation. Yet, as so often happens in war and in life, tragedy strikes in the most unexpected moments. On the same day that the world learned of the atomic bomb's devastating power at Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, Bong took off in a P-80 for a routine acceptance flight. Something went wrong with the fuel system, and the jet lost power shortly after takeoff. Bong attempted to eject, but was too low for a successful parachute deployment. He perished when the plane crashed in a nearby area, leaving behind a young wife, a grieving family, and a stunned nation. His death, overshadowed by the cataclysmic news from Japan, sent ripples through the U.S. military community and the public at large. Many Americans didn't learn of his passing until days later, once the initial shock of Hiroshima subsided. He was just 24 years old at the time of his death, a man who had accomplished more in a few short years than most could dream of doing in a lifetime. His body was returned to his family, and he was buried with full military honors in Poplar, not far from the fields he once roamed as a child. Marge received letters and condolences from top military brass, fellow pilots, and everyday citizens who had followed Bong's story through newsreels and newspaper articles. In the swirl of end-of-war celebrations, the loss of America's ace of aces felt like a painful reminder that even as wars conclude, the cost can still be high. For a while after 1945, Richard Bong's name faded behind the monumental events that closed World War II. But those who flew in the Pacific never forgot. In subsequent years, a renewed interest in the personal stories of the greatest generation propelled Bong's legacy back into the spotlight. Military historians pointed out how his tactics in the P-38 influenced fighter doctrine. emphasizing the advantages of deflection shooting and high-speed dives to gain a tactical edge. The fact that he maintained such a positive morale among his squadron mates, never boasting of his accomplishments, also became a point of admiration. He showed that leadership could be quiet and respectful while still producing extraordinary results. Monuments and memorials to Bong began to appear, particularly in his home state of Wisconsin. One of the most notable is the Richard Fur Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior, Wisconsin, which houses artifacts from his life and from the broader scope of American military history. Visitors can learn about his childhood on the farm, see vintage photographs of him smiling in front of his P-38, and read detailed accounts of the dogfights that made him famous. Highways, bridges, and small public parks also bear his name, particularly across the Midwest, serving as everyday reminders of a local hero who rose to international renown. A recurring theme in discussions of Bong's life is the idea of sacrifice, not just the final sacrifice of his life, but the smaller daily losses he endured during the war. He lost friends in the unit, witnessed the devastation of bombs, and carried the weight of having to outmaneuver and destroy enemy pilots. In some letters, Bong wrote about the emotional burden of counting kills, hinting that each victory also meant that another man, albeit an enemy, would never go home to his family. Though he often kept these reflections to himself, they lingered in his quieter moments. That empathetic streak did not make him any less effective in combat, but it framed his role as one more complicated than the hero posters suggested. Declassified documents from the era sometimes add intriguing footnotes to his story. For instance, wartime intelligence had meticulously tracked the movements of Japanese air units, and certain memoranda indicate that Bong's engagements were specifically guided by these intelligence briefs. He might have known more about enemy flight paths and base locations than your average pilot, giving him a tactical edge. Some argue it was pure luck that found him the right fights at the right times. Others claim it was a combination of intelligence, skill, and fate. Regardless, these behind-the-scenes details only confirm the complexity and coordination behind each successful mission. A few personal anecdotes from fellow pilots highlight unexpected moments of camaraderie and humor. One recalled how Bong, back at base after a harrowing mission, approached the mess hall with that same trademark humility, joking that even an ace can't fly on an empty stomach. Another story came from a ground crew member who remembered Bong personally helping fix a wiring problem in his P-38, ignoring protocol that usually kept pilots away from mechanical tasks. It was a testament to his farm-bred resourcefulness and to his commitment to making sure the plane was in perfect shape before the next sortie. When word spread through the fighter community of Bong's death, tributes poured in from around the globe. Some were official statements praising his service record and dedication. Others were more personal. Military forums of the day, often just letters circulated among units, spoke of him as a pilot who understood team cohesion. A stirring quote came from one of his squadron mates who said, "If you looked at him, you'd think he was any small-town kid, but in the cockpit, he was unstoppable." For decades since, as veterans gathered at reunions or posted their memories online in modern times, Bong's name still triggers a warm sense of nostalgia and respect. Younger aviation enthusiasts on platforms like Reddit have taken to analyzing his dogfight tactics, debating whether his style would hold up against modern jets. If we take anything away from his journey, let it be a reminder of how swiftly war can transform an ordinary individual into an extraordinary figure. And yet no amount of fame or skill can guarantee safety in a world brimming with risk, whether in the throes of combat or on a seemingly routine test flight. Richard Bong's story invites us to contemplate what it really means to serve, to sacrifice, and to come face to face with mortality for causes beyond oneself. We honor him not just for the victories, but for the grace and modesty he showed in the midst of such extreme circumstances. In parting, if you found yourself moved by the life of Richard Bong, there are countless other stories from World War II, and beyond that deserve our attention. You might explore the parallel legacies of other top aces, or investigate how the introduction of jet aircraft changed the very essence of aerial warfare. You could also look into the unsung heroes of ground crews and support staff, those who kept the war machine running yet rarely made the headlines. And of course, there are pilots from other nations, Allied and Axis alike, whose experiences provide another layer of complexity to the air war. History is inexhaustible in its ability to reveal the courage and frailty of humanity. By subscribing and following our journey into these narratives, you keep alive the memory of figures like Richard Bong. May his life remind us always of the profound personal stories behind each uniform, each flight, and each act of duty in times of conflict.